So what exactly is an API? Well, I actually got this question recently from a friend, so I figured it would be a great segue into actually creating something for them by making a video for you guys as well. Now, the acronym API stands for Application Programming Interface, and specifically what we're going to be talking about in this video is a web API, which would be an interface that we interact with over the web. But what does all that actually mean? Well, you kind of already probably know what application is if you're watching this video. To break it down a little bit easier, application programming interface basically sounds exactly like it is. You're interacting with an application through some type of programming language, most likely, that then gives you access or gives you the ability to interface or talk to that particular program or system. Most of the time when you're interacting or interfacing with a particular API, you're trying to get access to the data that is underneath it in a secure way. But if you want to tie a pretty bow on that definition, it's basically a set of rules that we can adhere to as programmers to responsibly get the data or some type of information that we need to do something with on the other side. Now, an API usually lives inside of a server, more than likely, but in this video, we're going to take that step-by-step baby steps at this point, and we're not going to go full out on the side of a server. We're just going to do everything locally on our own machine. The reason why you would typically put APIs on servers is so that you can access them wherever you are. Most of the time, you're going to allow users to concurrently or at the same time access the data or whatever the attribute that you're trying to get access to. Most of the time, you're going to allow your users to concurrently or at the same time access the data that you have so that you can keep track of who's accessing your data and where. So say, for example, I'm a user on the Disney Plus website and I'm looking for a particular show to go and watch. Obviously for me, that would probably at this point be X-Men. So in that case, I, being the user, would send a request to Disney Plus servers. They would then respond back to me with the correct video that I asked for. Now, if that doesn't happen, usually they would get a response back to say that what I was requesting did not come back to me, and they would then throw an error on the screen for me so that I know to either go do something else or tell them about it. But if everything checks out, I'm now sitting comfortably inside of this great chair that I'm sitting in right now, watching one of thousands of things on Disney Plus. More than likely at this point, like I said earlier, it would probably be X-Men 97. Now, typically, like I said earlier, you would want to query or manipulate some type of data underneath your API, usually either creating something, updating something, deleting something, or just grabbing and throwing it on the screen for the user. And in most cases, you're going to find yourself in two different types of places in terms of databases: NoSQL and SQL. So things like MongoDB, Firebase, and things like that would be a considerable understanding of a NoSQL database. And then obviously you have PostSQL, MySQL, and all those types of databases, which would be also known as relational databases as well. So without further ado, let's get into this video, which I'm going to show you how to build a API as fast as possible inside of 15 minutes or so in Flask, so that you understand how to go and build your own. But again, it's not going to be the full-fledged thing. We're going to get to that in a different video later on. All right, let's get coding. Okay, so the first thing you're going to want to do to get started is to go to poetrypython.org, and from there you're going to then get greeted with this wonderful screen that you see behind me right now. All this is just a way to hold or do virtual environments better. You will probably hear a lot of people talking about virtual environments and how they work and all that kind of stuff, but you want a simplified version to do virtual environment work and actually like doing it. You might want to pick up Poetry. It is a godsend in terms of managing your Python virtual environments, and if you've tried to do that on your own over the past few years and without Poetry, you know how hard that could actually be, specifically when you have things that could possibly be nested inside of each other. I'm talking a little bit too much. So here's what's going on here. We can do a lot of things with poetry. We highlighted that, but we can highlight or add things to our virtual environments really easily. If we are building full-on package of some sort, we can also build and then publish really, really easy just by these two commands here. That is a little bit too far off the scope of this video, but I just wanted to show you that this is possible. But in terms of what you will need to get started, in terms of what I'm going to be using in the next segment, you're going to want to go to the installation part of the docs and then scroll down till you see the pipx install poetry. This is going to give you everything that you need to get started. If you don't have pipx installed, you want to start with this link up here, follow that, then come back here, and then we'll be ready to go. Okay, so I'm assuming that you've now gone away and came back if you didn't have pipx installed on your local machine. Now that you do, go ahead and install poetry just like you see on the screen here. Hopefully you can see yep, you can. You can see behind me pipx install poetry, and that literally will give you everything that you need to get started that we're going to then use in the next part or creating our virtual environment. But if you are having some trouble doing any of that, don't worry, I will make future videos on that. Please bear with me. I'm trying to do all this as fast as I possibly can, but I'm trying to get all these video ideas out of my head as I think of them. So if you are having a little bit of trouble installing pipx or installing poetry, please leave a comment down below. I will be happy to answer any question that you might have. But again, this is just for sake of time so that we can actually get to the meat of what we're trying to get to, which is actually building an API. All right. Now that you have poetry installed, what you're going to want to do from here is just literally type poetry new, and we are going to call this project utent underscore API. Okay. So when you hit enter here, what's going to happen? Some magic is going to happen behind the scenes, and we're going to now have a package created for us called mutant underscore API inside of a folder called mutant underscore API. That might seem a little tricky, so let me explain what's going on there. Because of the way that Python or the way that poetry works, it is creating everything what we would need in terms of creating a Python project in general. So it doesn't necessarily know that we're doing a Flask application. It doesn't know that we're doing a Django application or a TensorFlow application. It just knows that it's something that has to do with Python. So it gives us enough boilerplate to actually get started. So if I go in here, and for those that are using Linux and Mac, this is going to be the same command. If you're using Windows, this would be dir instead. So I'll leave that on the screen if you need it. But in here, I'll say ls. And by the way, I have a lot of things inside of my dev project area. You probably either have a whole bunch like myself or nothing at all. That's perfectly fine. But what we're trying to do here, what I'm trying to show, is that we now should have a Mutant API folder that I have right here. And from here, if I want to then go into that, I would say mutant underscore API. Then again, if I ls inside of this, I would then see the contents of what I'm trying to do here, which in this case would be a Mutant API, which is what we saw up here. And this might be a little different from what you might be expecting to see, which this Py project toml file, if you've used a different package manager, similar to a requirements.txt, if you remember the older Python things of that nature, but it's very similar to a requirements.txt in the way that it kind of handles all of our dependencies and the version numbers and all that kind of stuff for the dependencies. All of that will go inside of the project toml file. So now that all that housekeeping stuff is out of the way, let's get right into actually creating what we need. And for that, we are going to need to install one dependency, which is going to happen to grab a whole bunch of other ones at the same time. But to do that, we're going to use poetry again, and we're going to say poetry add, and then Flask, if I can spell Flask here, and hit enter. That is then going to go out, grab Flask, download it, and install it inside of our virtual environment. But you probably are wondering where that virtual environment actually is living or actually, do we even have one at all? Yes, we do, and we can get started with that as well with poetry, and we can just say poetry shell, and that will then spawn that up and give me a beautiful virtual environment right here. So now that we have all of that, let's now get into what we came here for, which is then creating our API. So now that we have our virtual environment created, now we can head over to VS Code and get started on our API. All right, now that we have that done, let's go ahead and start creating the bare bones of our API, which is basically going to give us a test bed to make sure that Flask is actually working. So inside of Mutant API, we're going to create a new file called main.py. So main.py is what we're going to call this. You will see a init.py here as well. We are not going to do anything with that so far because it's just, again, there because of poetry doing the boilerplate stuff that it needs to do because it thinks that we're going to need. In this particular situation, we won't. But let me just make this a little bit bigger for you guys. Okay, so the first things that we're going to need to do are importing a few things here. So we're going to say import Flask. Oh, I'm sorry. From Flask. Import, we want Flask, requests, and JSONify. Now you may have noticed that I get a squiggly line up under here, and also that none of this was kind of code completed for me as well. That's because it is not grabbing the correct virtual environment. So in order to do that, again, if you're using Visual Studio Code like I am, you'll be able to go down to the area where you'll see your Python version. So you'll see your Python version next to Python. What you're going to be looking for after that is the name of the virtual environment that we're looking for here, which in our case would be Mutant API, and then a bunch of different characters after that, the version of Python that I'm using. So I'm going to go ahead and use that, and that should now go ahead and get rid of that squiggly line underneath Flask because it can find it now. And if I were to try and use these again, so if I say JSONify, it now knows where to find that as well. So that means that we are in the same place in terms of our virtual environment. So from here, now we're going to create our app, which is going to be Flask. I think that should be, yeah, that should be uppercase Flask here. And we'll say Flask of Dunder name. Cool. And from here, we'll say app.root, give our first root. And we'll just call this just backslash because it'll be the main root here. And we'll call this function, let's just call it hello. I won't say hello world because it's a little bit too much right. I don't feel like it. We'll do, in here, we'll say to me, my X-Men. Okay. So from here, if we go ahead and save, now what we should have the ability to do is run our server, and we should get a value of to me, my X-Men if we go to a browser, or if we use something that I'm going to use here in this video called Insomnia. So I'll go ahead and run my server. But before we actually do that, we actually need to tell Flask how to get started or run our program at the end. So if we just go ahead and run main.py, what we would probably see is nothing because they were not actually running the app at all. So we'll need to say if name equals main and then run the debug equals true. So that should now give us a pretty decent server that we can look at here. So Python mutant underscore API slash main.py. That then starts our server. Whoops, I have a server already running. Okay, so if I go ahead and do that one more time, and then there we go. We have a server that is now running on localhost 5000. Head on over to the browser of choice. So in my case, this will probably start Internet Explorer because I'm on Windows. If I go ahead and open that, that should now give me to me my X-Men. Exactly what we were expecting to see, but that's not an API. So how do we do the rest of it? Well, I'm glad you asked. Let's get to actually creating a route that we can then send some information to then get information back. Okay, so now that we have the basics of what we can do inside of Flask, let's go ahead and actually create our endpoints. The first endpoint that we're going to need, and I've kind of took the liberty to explain some of that already, we're going to need to get some information, post some information, put or delete, and all of that stuff basically is CRUD, or create, retrieve, update, and delete. So in our purposes, what we're going to need first are two methods or two endpoints that we can create our information with and then get that information after we've created it. So we're going to do that almost in the same area of sorts in terms of the succession of how fast we're going to do that. So without further ado, let's go ahead and create a route. Come on, there we go. A route that is then going to say create mutant, there we go. And here we're going to need a methods list, which in our case is just going to be post. By the way, that is inside of a list. That's inside of a list because we can have multiple methods. So that's the reason why methods is the name of this. So we'll say def create mutant. And we are going to basically find out what we have first. So find out if we are posting information, which we should know that we are, but in this case we're going to say if the request is equal to, or is method is equal to post. So if the request method is equal to post, then what we want to do is grab some data, and we want to say we want to get the JSON of that data, because again, every time that we give information to the API, most of the time in modern day situations, you're going to have a JSON object passed back to you. And if you don't know what that means, it stands for JavaScript object notation. And basically that is a way to serialize data. And again, that just means we take it and decouple it from what it used to look like to something that we can actually use. So from here, we'll just go ahead and do, we'll flesh out what we want to have inside of that data. So here we'll say we want a mutant ID, sorry, that will say data of ID. We'll then say we want a name, which will be name of, or data of name. We'll then say powers, which will be data powers. And email, which will then be data of email. All right. So now that we have all of that, we are then going to take all that data and slam it on into the dictionary that we're going to be using for storage of case and purposes, just a temporary situation. But we'll call this school of mutants, which will equal, or we'll find that based on the ID of the mutant. So mutant ID, and that's going to equal or have inside of it all of this goodness. So we'll say name, powers, email, and then also we need to have our ID in here. So we'll say mutant ID. All right. Add that good. Not a comma. All right, cool. So now that we have our now that we have all of our information that we need, we also need to create this school of mutants thing up here. So I'll make sure I do that before I forget. So we'll say school of mutants, which will be an empty dictionary. We should be able to return and just say JSONify data and 201. Cool. So we now have a a route that can create a mutant, but that's not any fun if we can just create it and not see anything. So let's go ahead and create a route that is now going to allow us to see those mutants. So we'll say at app.route of get dash mutant. We are also going to use mutant underscore ID here, and we'll do methods equal get. Again, we don't have to do this in terms of the get value because by default it is going to do that automatically. But if you want to keep it there, you can. I'm going to, just for the sake of some real estate, I'm going to take that out and end that just like that. Then from here, we can say that we need to figure out what we want to have inside of this. We'll say def get mutant by the ID. And if we do find the mutant by the ID, then we're going to look for them. So we'll say if the school, that did not need to come that fast, sorry about that. That should be school underscore of mutants. So if we find them, then we're going to place the data inside of a X-Men data object. And we'll say school of mutants, mutant ID. Otherwise, if we don't find that, then we are going to produce a different value, which in this case will be an error. And we'll say X-Men data will be equal to now a message, or we'll say error instead. And we say no mutants found with that ID. All right. Okay, and if all checks out here, we should now be able to return JSONify X-Men data. That should give us what we are looking for here in terms of being able to get the mutants and creating them as well. But there's a little bit more that we could do with this get endpoint here. And let's just say for the sake of example, we maybe had a get mutant with the ID of 1, and then we wanted to find out which comic they were actually available in. So in this case, if we were going with Scott Summers, who is Cyclops, he would have been inside of the very first issue of X-Men. So in this case, we are going to, or if we wanted to find that out or place that inside of our data as well, what we could then do is say comic, which is going to be equal to request.args.get at comic. And then from there, we'll say if we do find the comic, we'll say X-Men underscore data at comic is going to be equal to comic. Okay. So all that, if we do find that information, assuming that we would have a mutant created, we would then find that information here, and then we'll be able to get that information if we do have it. So let's go ahead and check to see what that is going to look like inside of our API. And to do that, we're going to use a program called Insomnia. Okay, so now that we're inside of Insomnia, let's go ahead and create the project that we're going to need here. So we'll say new project, so that little plus guy right there. We'll call this a mutant API, and we're going to place this inside of our local vault. And from here, we'll create a set of request collections. And again, we're going to call this mutant API collection. Hit create there. And from here, we'll say we need a HTTP request. This one is going to be our create request. Oh, there we go. Come on. There we go. So we'll say create request or create mutant which is going to need a post request here. So we'll change that. So we're going to need to start our server if we haven't. So we'll go back inside here. So inside of our server, we are going to need to say Python mutant. You guys can't see that. So Python mutant. So let me redo that again. So we'll say Python mutant API / main.py. And assuming that I didn't fat finger anything along the way there, we should get a running HTTP server. So we'll go ahead and paste that on in here, and then, or paste the base of the URL here, and then create mutant there. Then from here, we'll say if we need an ID of, let's just put that in a string of 1, then need a name, which for us will be Scott Summers. We'll then say we need a set of powers, or powers, which for us will be Beam. And from there, we'll do email, which then is going to be scott.summers@gmail.com. All right. So assuming that everything goes well and I didn't fat finger anything again, and hopefully you guys, you should be able to see that. So bring my face back on screen now and go ahead and hit send, and we should get, yay, we have 201 success. We have our data that came back to us. So now let's see if we can actually get it back. So we'll need to go back to the plus sign over here, HTTP request, and we'll need to do again, for the sake of time, grab this guy and modify it. So I'll copy that, paste it over here, and we will change this from create to get mutant. We want to get it by the ID here, and then we should say send, and yay, we do have the data that comes back successfully. Awesome. So what about that comic thing that I was talking about earlier? Well, the way that we can do that is just say comic equals 1. And if we do that and then go ahead and hit send again, we now add to that comic, or those values that we had before. Now we just have comic at the end of that, or at the beginning, whichever way it comes for you. But in this case, now we can actually see that we got the data that we were looking for because we created it the way that we were looking for it as well. And it's persisting inside of our memory for the time being for this project. Now we need to talk about how we would actually update this information and delete it. Okay, so let's update. To do that, we're going to need a route as well. Here we'll say app.route, which will be update-mutant based on the mutant ID. And this time we are going to need that method situation. So we'll say methods equals put. Here we will then do a def update mutant based on the mutant ID. And if the request that comes in has a method that is equal to put, then what we now want to do is find out if we have a mutant ID. So a mutant ID that's inside of our School of Mutants dictionary. Then what we want to do from there is say data equals request dot get JSON. Yet again, because again, we want to get the JSON that we were looking for, making sure that we actually updated the right thing. And from here, we'll just say School of Mutants set that equal to, looking based on the key of the mutant ID, and we'll set that equal to data. From here, we should be good. Let's see. Oops, that return needs to go inside here. Here, now that we have that, let's go ahead and see how we would actually delete this data as well. So we'll say delete mutants, And here's going to be fairly the same thing as the update, but we'll change just a little bit. So we'll say app.route delete dash mutant slash mutant utent ID. And again, we'll say methods. We'll set that equal to delete. Okay. So def delete mutant ID. And we'll do if request that comes in is equal to method equal to delete. Well, sorry, Visual Studio Code's trying to be really helpful, but not helpful at the same time. So we'll say delete here. So from here, we'll say if mutant ID in school of mutants. And we will then find that mutant and delete it based on the key or the ID. So we'll say del school, if we find it, school of mutants, school of mutants. Then from here, we'll turn the JSONified value of our message or error, I should say. So we'll say, no, actually that will be a message. So we'll say message of mutant. We'll leave that with a status code of 204. Else turn JSONify, and assuming that we have done everything that we needed to do without fat fingering anything. I don't believe I did. Yep, we should be good to just go ahead and run this. Go ahead back into Insomnia and see how this runs. Okay, so now that we're inside of Insomnia, we'll need to create some more HTTP request methods. So this one is going to be put. And again, we are going to copy the values from before, highlight them, change them a little bit, and we'll do create, I should say update mutant by their ID. Again, that should be 1. Assuming that I have one, so let me make sure that I have one, create it. And then I'll change this guy. So we were going to, let's say we wanted to update based on the ID, say ID of 1. Again, that should be a string because otherwise it will error out for you if you don't do that. Oh, I almost forgot. That needs to be double quotes. There we go. ID. And then we'll say name. We'll change the name here to Professor X. And then we'll do powers, which will be psychic powers, because I don't feel like spelling today. And then we'll do name, email, and we'll do prof.x@gmail.com. Assuming everything checks out there, we should be able to see a new value there. Cool. So now that we have a updated mutant, let's go ahead and test out that delete route as well. So we'll go ahead and say we need a new route. Go ahead and paste that guy right on in there. And we'll change this to delete. And I'm going to make sure that I don't confuse myself later. Change this to, and then from here, we'll say we want to delete and /1. Okay. And assuming that we should have one, because I think this is good. Yeah, okay. I'm just double checking. Now that we have that, we should be able to go ahead and hit send, and we get no body returned for response. But why? Because we have a 204 as our value in terms of what's going to be returned here. So if we go back inside of our projects, and if you do want to do this research yourself, you can, but 204 in terms of methods or method returns responses means that a value has been deleted, but there's nothing to really show because it's been deleted. So if you do want to actually see that come back to you, what you want to show or what you want to change that to is a 200 instead. If you go back here, I'll go back and create a new mutant, and I'll even update it again, and then go back and do a delete. Now we have our message that we had from out of our code. And if I go ahead and try this again, then again, I'll get the error message from here. So that now has everything that we would need to have in terms of a workable API. You can then extend this a little bit further to then make this even bigger or attach a database to that and all that kind of stuff. But this will get you started. Now that you have everything that you need to know in terms of getting started with an API, in terms of starting one with Flask, if you do need a suggestion on starting with the basics though, I suggest starting up here because that will get you everything that you need to know in terms of what you need to know with the Python language. It is a little bit of a longer video, so just bear with me there. If any of the syntax that was on the screen so far that was a little bit jarring or something you've never seen before, check this video out over here. And until next time, y'all be smooth. I'll see you in the next video. Blurred out.